Stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Book of Job 2:5.
An entire existence wiped from the face of the earth between dawn and dusk. The work of a lifetime, the legacy of a name, a large family, all consumed without the slightest warning on the horizon, without prophets announcing the judgment, without any visible explanation, just the brutal dust of destruction, and, at the exact moment, the soul screams for immediate help, the absolute and terrifying silence of the heavens. The story we are going to investigate today does not have its starting point in ashes or extreme pain. The story of the man from the land of Uz begins in the most perfect stability. There was a firmly structured routine, unquestionable respect at the city gates, a clear purpose, and a profound alignment with the sacred. Everything seemed to be strictly in its proper place. Job's reality was the visible proof of a life that made perfect sense, until, suddenly, without any smooth transition, the invisible shield is removed and everything begins to crumble. And the most disconcerting detail of this ancient tragedy is not the annihilation of material wealth or the unbearable mourning. It is the asphyxiating emptiness that settles in right after the loss. Because when tragedy strikes, the human mind desperately seeks logic, but there is no answer. There is no explanation for the suffering. All that remains is the echo of one's own weeping and a divine silence that crushes any attempt at comprehension. To understand the magnitude of the abyss into which this man was thrown, it is strictly necessary to turn our gaze to the seasons that preceded the dust and ashes. The story that unfolds in the ancient land of Uz is not about an outcast or someone whose irresponsible choices brought about their own ruin. On the contrary, before the pain tore his flesh and mourning invaded his courtyards, there was an almost perfect order established in his house. In that remote period, where the laws of survival were brutal and the desert winds did not forgive the weak, Job built a true empire. When the sacred texts list Job's assets, they are not using poetic figures of speech. We are dealing with precise historical data, a true statement of assets of a Bronze Age megacorporation. To make the size of this power very clear, if we convert his herd to the values of the modern agricultural market in dollars, the scenario is frightening. Historical records account for 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 1,000 oxen, and 500 female donkeys. Just in animal liquidity value, not counting inflation, Job possessed the equivalent of over $12 million today. But the real scale of his empire goes much further. To feed and maintain more than 11,500 heads of livestock in arid regions, he needed to control incalculable latifundia and lead a gigantic workforce. In power of influence and commercial monopoly, Job was not just a rich farmer. He was the equivalent of a modern billionaire, the greatest of all the men of the East, dictating the economy of his entire region. But the true fortress of Job's life did not rest on this mountain of wealth or on the extent of his productive lands. The true foundation of his existence was his non-negotiable integrity. His life was rigorously aligned with the fear of the sacred. There was an unshakable meaning in every single one of his daily actions. The logic that governed his world was clear and seemingly foolproof. Moral righteousness guaranteed the continuous protection of the heavens. He was so dedicated to this order that after his children's days of feasting, he would rise at dawn at the first ray of sunlight to offer burnt offerings, covering any possible sin they might have committed in the silence of their hearts. Job left no loose ends. He shielded his home with devotion and obedience. Stability was the air he breathed. When he walked to sit with the elders at the city gates, his presence demanded a reverent silence. The young men shrank back in respect, and the old men rose from their seats. Job was the judge who defended the orphan and the song of joy for the widows. The world made complete sense because the celestial scale seemed perfectly balanced. The wicked reaped the thorns of their own evil deeds, while the righteous rested under the shadows of secure tents. This was the unquestionable theology of his time, and it is fundamental to understand this profound structural piece to measure the violence of the blow that would come next. The fall is never as devastating as the one that strikes the man who built his fortress on the rock of righteousness. When the implacable force of destruction invades the sacred territory of order and shatters the life of the one who did everything rigorously right, the impact does not just destroy a millionaire bank account. This impact shatters the backbone of everything one believes. And before we move on to the dark day when Job's empire was completely wiped off the map, take a short pause. If you value diving into the scriptures to discover the real context and the deepest layers of these stories, leave your like and subscribe to the channel now. And take the opportunity to comment down below from which city or country are you watching us. We love to know how far these documentaries reach, and we will read and respond to everyone with the greatest affection. Have you left your comment? So let's follow the arrival of the wind that destroyed the land of Uz. The transition from order to absolute chaos in Job's life did not occur through a gradual decline. In analyses of historical or corporate crises, major collapses usually emit warning signs. A prolonged economic recession, a progressive illness, an escalation of political tension at the borders. Job's account, however, completely subverts this logic. The destruction happens directly, concentrated, and without any prior symptom. The collapse was triggered on a day of apparent routine normality, precisely when his heirs were gathered at the older brother's house, and indicative of security and stability. The first record of annihilation strikes directly at the base of the patriarch's production infrastructure. A single survivor arrives reporting the invasion of the Sabaeans, a nomadic group. This was not a simple, isolated theft of livestock, but an operation that dismantled the primary agricultural machinery. 500 yoke of oxen, responsible for plowing the lands, and 500 female donkeys were stolen. Simultaneously, the employees who operated this workbase were put to the sword. In a single attack, the engine of agrarian production that sustained the region was paralyzed. The detail that elevates the severity level of the account is not only the volume of what was lost, but the speed at which the information arrives. The text documents the overlapping of the tragedy with the exact marker. While he was still speaking, another messenger came. In practice, this describes a compound shock scenario. Before the human brain can process the logistical and emotional impact of the first crisis, the second piece of news lands. The second report does not involve human invaders, but a severe environmental anomaly. A fire of extreme proportions described in the records as fire from the sky, possibly indicating a massive electrical discharge or anomalous storm hit the pastures. The 7,000 sheep and the shepherds guarding them were consumed almost instantly. Job's primary liquidity, capital reserve, turned to ashes. The time window continues to compress. Immediately after this report, the third messenger reports a military-style incursion. The Chaldeans, described carrying out a tactical maneuver divided into 3 fronts, confiscated the 3,000 camels and eliminated the guards. This fleet represented the transport and export logistics of Job's empire. Without the camels, the commercial routes were definitively cut off. In a span of time that scholars estimate to be a few hours, the largest corporation in the ancient East was liquidated by a multifactorial attack: a border invasion, a natural disaster, and a tactical military incursion. Even so, total patrimonial loss is a purely external event. The bankruptcy of an empire is devastating, but the individual remains with their identity base intact if their lineage survives. The irreversible rupture occurs with the fourth messenger. The final report documents a structural collapse caused by an extreme weather event. A spiraling gust of wind crossed the desert with enough force to simultaneously hit the four corners of the masonry residence where the children were. The structural failure was immediate. The roof collapsed, crushing Job's 10 children. No one survived, except the bearer of the news. The continuity of his name and his entire family were eliminated on the same afternoon. The central aspect of this stage of the story is the engineering of the impact. The losses were successive and the impacts rigorously accumulated. Forensic psychology and trauma studies attest that grief processing requires a temporal pause. The mind needs isolation to encode and assimilate the absence of something or someone. Job was summarily deprived of this biological defense mechanism. The calamities ran over each other in a calculated way, stripping him of any temporal or emotional reference point. In a period of 24 hours, everything that defined and justified that man's existence disappeared. He found himself stripped of his entire reality without having enough time to process the trauma and without the slightest mental space to understand the new reality surrounding him. When the dust of destruction finally settles and the rubble of the tragedy stops moving, the primary instinct for survival gives way to a much more complex demand: the need for comprehension. Neurology and human psychology are programmed to operate based on the principle of cause and effect. Faced with a calamity, the mind immediately formulates the most fundamental question of our species: why? When a clear mistake is made, the punishment, however severe, makes practical sense. The suffering finds a logical justification that allows the individual to encode the event and, eventually, process the pain. However, in Job's case study, this basic equation of cause and effect was entirely violated. The ancient account is not merely a catalog of extreme losses. The true central axis of the story, what makes it an object of analytical study for millennia, is the profound epistemological crisis that sets in from the morning. Job's trauma does not reside exclusively in suffering the losses documented in the previous topic. The real torture is the requirement to suffer the worst of scenarios without any kind of prior or subsequent explanation. The psychological abyss opens at the exact moment the question is cast to the heavens, and the only answer that returns is a vacuum. There is no arrival of a prophetic messenger with an official verdict of condemnation. There is no transcendental revelation. There are no instructions on how to proceed amidst the crisis. The divinity, which he believed meticulously controlled every aspect of his prosperous life, simply remains in a state of hermetic silence. To understand the oppressive weight of this silence, it is necessary to analyze the unwritten contract that governed ancient societies. The worldview of that time operated under the strict theology of retribution. The general sociological rule determined that divine justice functioned in an immediate and mathematical way. Prosperity was the public attestation of God's approval, and misfortune was the inevitable receipt for a hidden sin. Upon suffering the collapse, Job expected, at the very least, the presentation of the accusation so that the verdict would make sense. But the lack of an answer broke the laws of moral physics of that universe. The silence began to exert a crushing pressure, vastly exceeding the weight of the physical pain, the sores that would soon appear, and the patrimonial loss. This occurs due to a characteristic of the mental design itself. Consciousness abhors information gaps. When an objective answer is denied, the mind collapses, trying to fill the void with theories. The individual begins to scour their own past, investigating non-existent flaws or oversizing small mistakes in a desperate attempt to make the punishment make some logical sense. It is the mind torturing itself to find order in chaos. This is the point where Job's story ceases to be about financial ruin and becomes about the disorganization of the entire structure of thought. Understanding the depth of this silence and the theological setting in which it occurs requires more than a superficial reading of the sacred texts. It requires understanding the exact moment this man lived. Many historical analysts point to the account of Job as one of the oldest events in the canon, occurring in the patriarchal period, long before the existence of legal codes such as the Torah. When we do not understand where on the timeline the events are situated, the dimension of the historical isolation of these characters loses its force and the analysis is compromised. To solve exactly this lack of temporal contextualization, I recommend using the ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order. This material works as a visual analysis tool that organizes each book and each event in its exact historical sequence, eliminating the confusion of reading out of order. For those studying the scriptures with a documentary and historical focus, it is an indispensable support material. The link to acquire the official file is pinned in the first comment right below. Check it out later. Now, we need to analyze the next phase of this collapse. What happens in the human psyche when the silence coming from above forces the emergence of other voices down here? The vacuum left by the absence of answers never remains empty for long. The sociology of human behavior in extreme crisis situations demonstrates a clear rule. When the higher authority falls silent, the surroundings immediately begin to produce noise. The collective mind does not tolerate anomalies that escape its capacity for categorization. And it was exactly this oppressive dynamic that surrounded the shattered man on the margins of the land of Uz. The news of the systemic bankruptcy of the region's largest producer did not take long to travel the ancient trade routes. Three highly influential leaders, described in the annals as friends of the patriarch, traveled from their territories to observe the magnitude of the disaster. The historical record indicates that, upon arriving, they followed the strict protocol of Oriental mourning. They sat on the ground, covered in dust, and remained in absolute silence for 7 days and 7 nights. The visual shock of Job's physical degradation and patrimonial ruin was so staggering that words failed at first. However, the resistance of the human brain to the inexplicable has an expiration date. When God's silence persisted, the need to rationalize the tragedy took command. The voices around Job began to articulate what the social structure of the time demanded: a logical, mathematical, and implacable diagnosis for the disaster. The long debate that begins between them represents the anatomy of the quick conclusions that society imposes on those facing calamities. The arguments presented were not emotional consolations, but technical and purely causal interpretations of the theology of their time. The central thesis of the three men was inflexible and can be summarized in a simple equation. The balance of the universe does not commit operational flaws. If a punishment of maximum severity was executed, it is because a crime of equivalent gravity was hidden under the garments of piety. From this premise, the mourning was transformed into an inquiry. They began to dissect Job's character. Initially, the approach was indirect, utilizing old traditions and supposed night visions to suggest that human nature is flawed by definition. However, As Job rejected the diagnosis, the accusations escalated into frontal and aggressive attacks. The patriarch was accused of oppression against the poor, corruption, falsehood, and undeclared crimes. From an analytical perspective, the accusatory posture of those men functioned as a blind psychological defense mechanism for themselves. They desperately needed to blame the victim to shield their own sense of security. If Job was indeed innocent and yet crushed for no apparent reason, this meant a breach in the laws of the universe. It meant that random chaos could annihilate any of them the next morning. For the human mind, it is psychologically safer and more comfortable to believe that the destroyed man is secretly guilty than to accept the terrifying unpredictability that tragedy can strike the righteous. The practical result of these interpretations was the lethal aggravation of the patriarch's isolation. None of those speeches solved the equation. They were just failed attempts to give meaning to what the divinity had left in the dark. The so-called friendly fire hit the victim in his most vulnerable trench, transforming what should have been a support network into a hostile tribunal. And it is under the crushing pressure of this false judgment that the internal conflict of the victim reaches a critical point. Human resistance has an exact metric of tolerance. When acute physical deprivation aligns with the social isolation imposed by former allies and the prolonged silence of the sacred, the psychological structure reaches its operational limit. There comes a point on the timeline of tragedy when the basic act of continuing to exist becomes an almost insurmountable effort. The forensic analysis of Job's dialogues reveals that this extreme exhaustion did not occur due to a degradation of his character or a sudden loss of faith. The internal collapse occurred, fundamentally, due to the absolute lack of understanding of the mechanics of that suffering. The patriarch's documented response to continuous oppression head-on breaks the paradigms of traditional religious behavior. Popular culture and institutions often demand that the suffering individual endure calamity with a passive, resigned, and almost anesthetized silence. Unconditional acceptance is expected. However, the records show a man who categorically rejects emotional silence. At the height of the trauma, the patriarch does not retreat to suffer in silence. He verbalizes the pain. He questions the viability and utility of his own birth. He dismantles the fallacious arguments of his accusers and, surpassing the limits of prudence of his time, openly demands a direct hearing with the highest authority of the universe. Job expresses his agony without using the filters of false piety. He does not try to mask the degradation of his physical health or the bankruptcy of his empire with speeches of artificial conformity. He does not hide his anger, his sense of injustice, and his complete disorientation in the face of what he considers an arbitrary judgment. The record of his speeches is a brutal archive of transparency. The text exposes an individual who demands that the judge responsible for the collapse of his world present himself, lay down the facts, and formally declare the accusation. It is precisely this drastic breach of protocol that makes the document so true from the perspective of human analysis. The narrative subverts the unrealistic expectation that the man in acute pain is not allowed to feel frustration or abandonment. What is documented in those chapters is a much more complex and resilient definition of human faith. The practical realization is that conviction is not synonymous with the suppression of emotions or intellectual paralysis. In that scenario, faith manifested itself as the raw, naked courage and honesty to directly confront the divinity, refusing to accept a false diagnosis fabricated by men. This confrontational posture takes the debate to its most critical stage. Job exhausts the entirety of his argumentative defense resources. He refuses to yield and, simultaneously, reaches the final barrier of his capacity for comprehension. And it is exactly at the apex of this psychological stress, when the limits of human resistance are completely consumed, that the dynamic of silence suffers an abrupt and terrifying interruption. Job's exhaustion reached the limits of human physics and psyche, and it is in this exact temporal vacuum, when the theories of men completely lose their practical utility and the internal collapse reaches its maximum degree, that the anomaly occurs. The documentary record does not report a smooth descent, a comforting light, or a silent manifestation to console the sufferer. The atmospheric and existential scenario changes abruptly and violently. A storm of severe proportions, described in the annals as a whirlwind, forms over the environment. The answer finally breaks the barrier of silence that was crushing the patriarch, but the exact form and content of this interruption absolutely subvert all logical and theological expectations that had been built up to that moment in the story. The tribunal that Job had so vehemently demanded was established, but the configuration of the hearing was completely altered. From the perspective of crisis analysis, what happens next is disconcerting. The patriarch had filed an official request for explanations. He wanted the cause. He demanded that the why of all his disgrace be documented and presented transparently. However, the voice emanating from within the storm offers absolutely no justification. There is not the slightest mention of the agreement made in the celestial spheres that triggered the event. There is no citation of the adversary or the cosmic wager. The most striking detail of this phase of the narrative is that the divinity simply ignores the human demand for a mathematical and linear explanation for the suffering. What is delivered is not a justification. Instead of providing an explanatory dossier, the supreme authority responds to the patriarch's inquisition with a relentless interrogation. The tactic used is a successive bombardment of questions that transcend human morality and dive directly into the astrophysical, meteorological, and biological engineering of the cosmos. The voice questions Job about the structural foundation of the earth, about the containment mechanics of the oceans, about the gravitational control of gigantic constellations like the Pleiades and Orion. The narrative violently shifts the focus from the navel of a single man's individual pain in the East to the unimaginable complexity of the administration of the entire universe. The technical intent of this narrative maneuver is not to humiliate the suffering individual, but to surgically recalibrate his perception of reality. Job's mind operated on a strict two-way street. Obedience generates immediate reward. Sin generates mathematical punishment. The divine speech pulverizes this two-dimensional logic, revealing that the operation and maintenance of the universe are infinitely more complex, branched, and unfathomable than the human metric of justice is capable of calculating. The cosmos is not a machine of simple exchanges. It is a complex web of variables sustained by a single force. The cosmic investigation advances to the biology of the untamable. The texts record the detailed description of extreme and ferocious creatures, named in the records as Behemoth and Leviathan. In the literary culture of the ancient Near East, these figures did not merely represent large animals. They were the living symbol of the forces of absolute chaos, of untamable danger, and of what human engineering is unable to subjugate. By asserting unrestricted dominion over these beasts, the voice in the whirlwind establishes a fundamental premise. The universe contains highly dangerous, chaotic elements far beyond civilizational understanding. But absolutely none of this operates outside the jurisdiction or direct control of the Creator. What seemed to be absolute and ungoverned chaos in Job's life, the loss of production, the multiple mourning, the destruction of his name, was not forensic proof that God had abandoned his command post. It was merely the practical realization that the human mind lacks the cognitive capacity to read the floor plan of cosmic reality. And it is at this exact point that the paradigm of the story irreversibly changes. The shock of perception alters Job's psychological state. The man who demanded a detailed report suddenly understands that a technical explanation would be of no use whatsoever. If the invisible motives were listed to him, Job would still be just a limited human brain trying to audit the mind of the architect of the universe. The true answer delivered to the patriarch was not a package of processable information. It was a physical and unquestionable presence. The profound trauma that disorganized Job's entire life was not resolved by the restoration of explanatory logic, but by the visual realization that the ruler of the universe was there. Because the necessary answer for a human being to be able to continue existing is not always perfectly understanding the gears of the problem. Sometimes, the only viable answer is to perceive exactly who is in control of the machine. The cure for Job's collapse did not come through the relief of ignorance, but through the confrontation with sovereignty. The silence was not broken with a why, but with the irrefutable manifestation of the one who governs the storm. And so that you can understand the weight and density of this millennial dialogue, it is crucial to access the texts in their correct historical structure. The depth of God's answer and Job's change only make complete sense when we do not get lost in the disorder of the books. That is why the e-book, the Bible in chronological order, is the definitive file for your research and study. This material organizes the entire timeline of sacred events, allowing you to follow the exact story without the flaws of fragmentation. To carry out solid documentary analyses and truly understand the setting of these narratives, secure your copy through the link pinned in the first comment right below. The natural conclusion to the greatest documented collapse of the ancient world is not a manual of explanations. Job's story does not answer all the questions the human mind formulates in the face of extreme pain. And perhaps, from the perspective of the deepest analysis, this is exactly the central point of the entire narrative. The outcome of the account does not present a scene in which the heavens open to justify the suffering. The patriarch is never informed about the cosmic council or the invisible reasons for his ruin. Not everything will be explained. Not everything will make sense the moment the impact hits. Our biology and psychological structure require the relationship of cause and effect. We have been conditioned to view life as an exact mathematical equation. Good deeds should guarantee protection, and mistakes should result in punishment. When a catastrophe strikes someone who did everything strictly right, the mind short-circuits. However, the reality of the administration of the cosmos does not function like a transaction machine and is not obliged to account to our logical reasoning. By exposing this implacable reality, the document destroys the commercial and utilitarian view of belief, the one that tries to sell faith as an insurance policy armored against suffering. If an individual's integrity depends exclusively on the rewards and shielding they receive, then true character does not exist. There is only a contract of convenience. What was tested in the land of Uz was not merely Job's biological capacity to withstand bankruptcy and disease, but his ability to maintain his sanity when this contract seemed to have been unilaterally torn up. The text forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The universe contains inexplicable variables, and divine silence is not a sign of abandonment, but proof that control belongs to a sphere our minds cannot audit. Many superficial analyses make the mistake of treating the end of the story when Job's material prosperity and family are restored twofold as the great moral lesson or climax of the account. But the return of the assets is merely an administrative epilogue. The true pinnacle of the story occurred much earlier, amidst the rubble. The climax took place at the exact moment Job declared that he had previously known the sacred only by hearsay, through theories and traditions, but that through extreme trauma and direct confrontation with the storm, his perception had been expanded. The cure was not the return of the flock. The cure was the end of the arrogance of thinking that the mind of God needed to fit into his small box of human logic. The chronicle of the man who lost an empire in 24 hours crosses millennia, not to teach us formulas on how to avoid pain, but to show us that when all the lights go out, there is still something that remains: the possibility of continuing, the ability to take the next step, even and especially when you hold absolutely no explanation in your hands. Faced with an abrupt loss, mourning that arrives without warning, or a crisis that disrupts the entire structure of life, the mind will always scream out, demanding a reason. It is a natural reflex, but the narrative of Job redirects our existential investigation to a much more mature level. It teaches us that faith, in its purest and most resilient state, is not about rigorously understanding the mechanics of everything that happens. Faith is about enduring. It is about not abandoning the position, even when the sky above you decides to maintain the most absolute silence. At the end of the day, when the storm passes and the rubble needs to be cleared, the most important question of your life will not be, "Why did this happen to me?" The only question that will truly define your future will be, "What do you do when there is no answer?" If you value this level of research and want to continue unraveling the deepest layers of the scriptures, leave your like on the video and subscribe to the channel. It is your subscription that allows us to continue producing documentaries with this quality. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.